Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I know a lot more people are still on the way in. I'm Lori Brown. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut League of Conservation Voters, and I'm joined today by CTLCV Deputy Director Connor Yakaitis. CTLCV is a statewide nonprofit dedicated to advancing the environmental policies at the state legislature to protect our land, air, water, wildlife, and climate. And so today we're going to be reviewing the results of the 2026 legislative session from an environmental point of view. CTLCV's legislative watch list of significant environmental bills was based on top priorities that were identified by our many environmental colleagues at the start of the legislative session. This was a very short and difficult 3-month session where lawmakers were focused on key social issues and mitigating the impacts of the Trump administration's policies and funding cuts. However, we held our footing in a highly competitive year. We've just invited prominent legislative leaders to discuss some of the major initiatives they worked on, and these include Representative Jonathan Steinberg, who's the House co-chair of the Energy Committee, Representative John Michael Parker, who's the co-chair of the Environment Committee, Senator Tony Hwang, Chief Deputy Republican Leader in the Senate. And I do want to note that Senate Majority Leader Bob Duff has a conflict today, but I think he's going to try to join us towards the end of the hour. So these lawmakers have been essential to our environmental efforts at the Capitol. Before we bring each of them on to give us their thoughts on the session, I'm going to take about 10 minutes to run through some of the environmental bills that passed, some of them that did not, and some of the bills that we helped to stop. So also to everyone who's online, please, throughout this debrief, do post your questions using the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen, not in the chat. That's not going to be open for comment. So use the Q&A feature, and all throughout the session, please do put your questions in. So here's a few of the highlights of the bills that passed on a variety of issues. One of the most high-profile environmental bills this year was House Bill 5340 in the Energy Committee regarding our state's solar energy programs. This bill was championed by Representative Steinberg to do a few things, including extending our state's 3 solar incentive programs, streamlining the residential solar permitting process, allowing plug-in solar, and studying agrivoltaics, among other things. So Representative Steinberg is going to speak more about this legislation and what it means for our state. CTLCV, and the V stands for voters, also celebrated passage of a top democracy priority, the no excuse absentee voting legislation that was put forward by the Government Administrations and Elections Committee. House Bill 5001 implements a no excuse absentee voting system that voters approved in a statewide referendum back in 2024. And that brings us to the final step of a nearly 6-year campaign to get that passed. Moving on to the Environment Committee, which worked on the majority of the bills that we tracked. The committee put forward House Bill 5334 to protect riparian areas. This legislation was the result of a large bipartisan task force led by Representative Mary Mashinsky to make recommendations on how to regulate and protect the natural vegetation along our rivers and lakes. And that, of course, ensures clean water, healthy habitats, and climate resiliency. There was major pushback by DEEP and the home builders, and this bill was changed to become a training program to strengthen the inland wetland commissions and included funding for a DEP staff person to implement the program. And I know Representative Parker can speak more about this legislation. The Environment Committee also put forward a bill related to pesticides. DEEP's database of pesticide use in our state is woefully inadequate and incomplete. So House Bill 5155, the Pesticide Modernization Act, required DEEP to have an online searchable database of pesticide sales and use in our state, including pesticide-coated seeds. DEEP did object to that, but the bill was amended to create a work group to allow for the different stakeholders to clarify what is needed in the database. And this bill passed as it was amended. A major environmental debate this session involved Connecticut's landmark bottle bill program with legislation in both the Environment and the Finance committees. And the problem they're trying to solve is cross-border fraud, where people are illegally bringing large quantities of bottles and cans from neighboring states that have a 5-cent deposit or no deposit to redeem them in Connecticut for 10-cent deposit. The other problem is the illegal sale of beverages that have been purchased out of state and then sold in Connecticut, and that can then also be redeemed for the 10-cent deposit. So the beverage industry wanted to roll back Connecticut's deposit to 5 cents, which would have crippled our recycling program. But the redemption businesses wanted stronger enforcement of existing laws. So I'm sure we're going to hear more about this and the bottle bill legislation from Representative Parker in a moment. The legislature also passed a bill to ban the intentional release of helium balloons in Senate Bill 452, which pollute our waterways, entangle wildlife, and can be lethal to aquatic animals. The last bill I'll mention in the bills passed category is 5525 to address invasive aquatic plants. And this legislation allows for the rapid response of our state against new infestations of the invasive hydrilla plants that are really causing havoc in our rivers and our lakes. Now I'm just going to turn to a few important bills that had some great momentum but did not make it over the finish line. A top environmental priority this year was waste materials management. So House Bill 5524 sought to expand our commercial organics recycling law to include food donation, to reduce single-use plastics and styrofoam containers, and to provide access to funding for waste reduction programs. And after years of advocacy, it was really difficult to see this popular bill fail. However, there was a significant win with $15 million in funding for municipalities to support solid waste reduction strategies. So more on that. Another waste-related bill, the tire EPR legislation, House Bill 5157, would have amended the current law to require that tire retailers participate in the tire stewardship program alongside the tire wholesalers who are already in the program. This passed the House, but not the Senate. A bill originally intended to phase out the gas-powered leaf blowers, Senate Bill 319, would have allowed landscape companies to access green bank financing to purchase battery-powered equipment. This passed the Senate, but not the House. But environmental leaders did move two major climate-related initiatives forward this year, but they're going to need to continue that fight for the passage of these two bills. The Climate Superfund bill, House Bill 5156, that would have required polluters to help pay for the cleanup and to repair damage caused by climate change. And the other one is the Environmental Rights Amendment, Senate Joint Resolution 37, to amend the Connecticut State Constitution to ensure that all the communities in Connecticut have equal rights to clean and healthy environment. And lastly, we were relieved that three controversial bills did not pass this year. First, a bill on wake surfing, Senate Bill 313, which would have established or could have established weak laws regulating a relatively new water sport, wake surfing. And these specialized wake boats can really cause major damage to lake beds, shorelines, and habitat. And they do impede the shared public use of Connecticut's waters. So fortunately, this bill did not get out of the Environment Committee, but a work group is going to be established to make recommendations to regulate this activity going forward. The second one is a bill on bears, Senate Bill 146. That did not pass. Our current law already allows for the killing of bears with a permit after other non-lethal methods have been tried but failed to deter them from damaging crops. So this legislation would have eliminated the requirement to try those non-lethal measures and allow a farmer to kill any bears suspected of causing damage in the prior year. And the third bill was one that was defeated that could have allowed the automatic permit renewals of solid waste facilities, House Bill 5154. Many advocates stood together in opposition of that legislation for a host of reasons. So I just want to say this is absolutely not an exhaustive list of the environmental bills this year. We're going to be putting out our environmental scorecard next month. That'll include descriptions of these and other bills that were important this year, and also how legislators voted on these bills. So now I'm just going to pass it over to Connor Yakita so that he can introduce some of our legislative speakers and provide their insights on both the session and some of the bills that they worked on this year. Connor?
Thank you so much, Lori. As Lori mentioned, we are joined by several environmental champions who work hard each session to pass key environmental legislation, while also tackling numerous other issue areas. The League is grateful for their leadership and for always having an open door to listen to our input. We will be especially bummed to see two of the folks on the call today leave the legislature at the end of the year, but more on that on a moment. Our first speaker is Representative Jonathan Steinberg. Rep. Steinberg has been a leading voice in the Connecticut General Assembly on clean energy, environmental protection, and public health policy. Throughout his tenure, Representative Steinberg has championed policies aimed at advancing renewable energy, modernizing Connecticut's energy systems, shaping our state's water policies, and helping the state meet its long-term clean energy and climate goals. As a thoughtful and respected legislative leader, he has played a key role in passing laws that promote sustainability, energy affordability, and environmental resilience. As he retires from public service, we really want to take a moment to recognize and thank Representative Steinberg for his years of leadership, enthusiasm, and commitment to building a cleaner and more efficient future for Connecticut. With that, I'll turn it over to Representative Steinberg. Thank you so much for being here. Oh, you're muted, by the way.
Thanks, Connor. I really do hope this is not the last time I'm interacting with on a league call. We'll have to find some way to keep me in the mix. As Laurie alluded to earlier, this was we've had several consecutive years really feeling like the environmental cause has been on the defensive, much of it emanating from Washington, but there's been a almost national retreat in many ways. And I'm pleased to say that really not so in Connecticut. And I think that's because of the hard work of the Environment Committee chairs, John Michael Parker and Rick Lopes, and the fact that we had the support of the League and a broad coalition of environmental partners that gave us confidence we could move forward. And every year we have successes and disappointments, but I do think this was a year of accomplishment. In the case of 5340, the solar incentives bill, we were faced with a bit of a conundrum this year. Thanks to the Trump cuts and impediment of everything related to renewable energy, the industry was already in a tough place. And we actually were debating this year whether or not it was the right year for us to move forward with solar incentives. Or given the urgency of the affordability crisis, maybe we just take a pass. Maybe we would only seek to extend the incentives that are due to expire next year. We took the harder path. We worked on a much more comprehensive program consistent with the goal we had established 2 years ago, and we asked PURA to review the existing programs to make them more efficient, cost effective, and particularly recognize the fact that we had to be economically responsible, that people are very focused on their electric bills. And we put together a program that is intended to actually reduce ratepayer costs, reduce the public benefits charge by imposing what we'd call a soft budget target as opposed to a hard cap across the existing programs, meaning our residential solar, our non-residential solar, our SCEF community program, which is now focused exclusively on low income, because that's really an important area for us. And most importantly, what we call the newest of the programs, the ESS, the energy storage program. The biggest feature of this bill going forward is the focus on storage as a way to fully activate the value of solar panels across the country. And we did that in a variety of ways. We created a pilot that will be overseen by the Green Bank to look at former solar customers who have solar, to encourage them to take on storage, and through metric analysis, determine what that added value is. We do believe for every dollar invested in solar plus storage, you get about $1.60 back. And that's a good answer, and is really the future of dealing with both intermittency, but also importantly, creating an interactive, dynamic grid in which we can be sending electrons back when needed, helping with peak shaving and avoiding having to build out more infrastructure by through behind the meter solar. So it's a comprehensive program. It gives PURA some time to promulgate the precise rules, and we give them tremendous discretion on tweaking the program in real time, both in terms of the incentives and maybe even the budget targets year to year, such that we honor our obligation to ratepayers to spend their money wisely, but keep our solar programs moving forward more dynamically, more enhanced than they were before. And this program will run through 2035, and we believe will provide Connecticut citizens, whether businesses or individuals or municipalities, more opportunities to make solar part of their mix, to give people back control, some sense of agency over their electric bill by actually having something to do with generation. I do believe that this legislation will really be the foundation for what solar is going to be in Connecticut and across the nation in just a period of years. And I'm really very pleased, even though we struggled till the very end and there was a little bit of nervousness as it passed the Senate on the last day of session. Even the developers who were initially wary and concerned stuck with the program, contributed. We negotiated very carefully to make sure that what we were doing was fair to everybody. And I think everybody would agree we came out in a good place, which is very good news for the state and makes me feel like I'm going out in the right way, looking out for Connecticut ratepayers. And I'm glad to answer any questions.
Yeah, so obviously it was a short session. I believe I read it was the shortest session in history. Obviously 5340, a lot in the bill. Can you talk about just some of the challenges that you and the committee faced from start to finish? And how
You
were able to
mentioned this
get
is
through
the
it?
shortest of short sessions. And I just read that we actually passed more bills this year than we did in the long session last year. So much for that. I think it really sharpened the skills of all the chairs and rankings across the committees to try to really get their acts together earlier so that the bills could actually be passed. We started this well before session. It's really been, work we've been doing for a couple of years. But I don't think any of us anticipated quite the situation we'd be in this year with the affordability issues, and that we'd really need to build into this framework some sort of controlling superstructure that would keep costs in a relevant range. And that was really where a lot of it started, was setting that target, how is going to be measured both on a dollar and a megawatt basis, and developing some wrinkles to it, like exempting solar plus storage from the budget target, so that purer priority would not be inhibited by the budget target, and yet still make sure that we weren't spending wildly in this environment. I hope, gives the developers a reason to believe that the industry can persevere and maybe even prosper, even while the federal government is doing everything within their power to undermine renewable energy. And that was part of our goal, to get us through the next several years and be in a position where, hopefully, with a more thoughtful administration in the White House and maybe a Congress prepared to actually do its job, that we will have a more enlightened policy going forward, which can actually match up well with what Connecticut is doing. And we looked at other states, states that have been strong champions, like New York and Massachusetts, who are also debating further retreat in these areas. And I think we were an example to the regional states that you could both be economically responsible and still advance the cause. I think people are much more focused on solar now than they were even a few months ago. What's going on in the Persian Gulf made everybody realize that our reliance on fossil fuels is really not going to be a long-term strategy for us. So I think a lot more people are going to be interested in solar. So it'll be very interesting to see the results of the Green Bank pilot, and also to see the kind of rules that Pura comes up with that will make clear to the industry, to individuals, to municipalities, whatever, what exactly they can expect and what kind of incentives they're eligible for. So, we worked with all the partners across the board. I will say that this is pretty much a Democrat initiative. The Republicans were, with the exception of Senator Hwang, who voted for the bill in the Senate, were generally opposed to it. And that makes me a little sad. This should not have been a partisan issue. And for the longest time, solar was not partisan. And I hope we get back to a point where it's not partisan again.
Thank you. There's an interesting section in the bill that will require a study that focuses on the value of solar. I was hoping you could speak more on to why that is so important, moving forward.
Yeah, it's been a struggle for us for many years, doing a true value of distributed energy, or VDER. Frankly, I've come to the opinion it's not just about looking at the value of solar. It's really having an apples to apples comparison of all generation sources. So they're really fairly compared. When you're looking at solar, we're forgetting the fact that after you build it out, the energy is free. Free is my best price. I love free. So compared to other sources, which you have to pay for, once you get solar built, it really pays off for you. So to have a level playing field, we should be looking at all the costs that contribute to each generation source. If we want to talk about natural gas, if you want to add more natural gas, you got to build a pipeline. That's 10 years and so many millions of dollars. Nobody's jumping up to do that. When it comes to nuclear, it's great. I'm a big fan of nuclear, but maybe 10, 12 years before we could get a project done. And with any remote generation, you've got to bring it to the customer, meaning you've got to build out a lot of infrastructure. So I think if we did a real value of solar compared to other generation sources, not even including the pollution costs, the environmental costs of fossil fuels, solar would look better and better. And when you combine solar with storage, you've got really the perfect setup, because you've eliminated the intermittency issue, and you've also given us more power to actually influence outcomes by having two-way exchange of electrons between batteries in the homes and businesses or in large storage arrays and the grid, helping us avoid the possibility of brownouts or blackouts in the summer or winter time when we hit our peaks.
Great, thank you. I think it's safe to say that energy affordability is one of the top issues here in Connecticut. However, as you are very well aware, energy policy is very complicated, making it very difficult for the average ratepayer to understand, and this makes it in turn easier for political disinformation to spread. What can be done to better inform the public on practical and attainable solutions to this affordability crisis, and what kind of misinformation would you like to correct?
I think I'd start with one which was promulgated during this session, that we would be adding billions of dollars to public benefits. That's not the case. We are continuing existing incentive programs that are paid for through public benefits. And by the way, currently are less than 1 cent per kilowatt hour on your entire bill, to a program which continues the programs at a lower target, so that ultimately we believe we will save ratepayers money. So that's the first thing I want to deal with. The second thing was a canard started by the utilities and picked up by the Republicans, unfortunately, which talked about the full cost of the contracts. Remember that when we sign on for a lot of these, they're 20-year contracts. And if you look at the full value of those 20 years, it does amount to a lot of money, but it's sort of like saying, you're going to take out a mortgage and you're more interested in how much you're going to pay over the lifetime of the 30-year mortgage than what your monthly costs are. Most people really care about what their monthly bill is. And to put out there that this is costing tens of billions of dollars is not only misleading, it's truly disingenuous. And that's really not the way the programs are structured. And I want people to be confident that that at least their public benefits charges are not going to be rising through the roof. However, there are any number of other factors we know which will cause energy bills to rise: rising delivery costs for infrastructure investment. And the courts just ruled that Eversource is going to get its 1.8 billion in storm costs all at once. That, and the fact that Eversource is coming in for a rate case this year, means that there'll be tremendous pressure on bills. And that is all because of factors not related to generation like solar, but to a lot of other issues. And I think ratepayers need to be prepared for the reality, the hard reality, that in the longer term, bills are more likely to go up.
Great. One last question before we move along. As we mentioned, you've served 16 years in the legislature, many of them on the Energy and Technology Committee. that is known as one of the more complicated and technical committees in the legislature. What lessons have you learned, and how has Connecticut's energy landscape changed during your tenure?
I've been on the Energy Committee all 16 years in the legislature. Then the Yale professor Dan Esty impressed me at a League of Conservation Voters Summit to get on the Energy Committee, not knowing he was going to become the next commissioner of the new deep. I didn't know much more about energy policy than flipping on the lights. And I think the most interesting thing about energy and technology is not that it's the heaviest heaviest lobby. It's that you never get to the mountaintop. There's always another peak after it. It's a tremendously humbling committee because of the truly complex nature of a lot of things we're talking about. There are more acronyms I'm still learning after 16 years. And as I said, you can have tremendous depth of knowledge and still only have scratched the surface in an industry that's evolving very quickly as well. And I do believe the landscape 5 years from now will be very different than we look at today. And I'm actually going to be cheering from the sidelines to make sure that the legislature and the league keeping moving us forward. So it's been a great 16-year run. More wins than losses, more joy than trepidation. And I want to thank the league for being a good partner throughout.
Excellent. Well, I think we can speak for pretty much everyone on this call when we thank you for your service and your leadership and your dedication to energy in the state. Um, we're going to move on next to Senate Majority Leader Bob Duff, who will soon be our next Senate President. Having served in the legislature since 2001 and the Senate since 2004, Senator Duff has been a longtime advocate for environmental protection, clean energy, and sustainability initiatives across the state. Throughout his legislative career, Senator Duff has supported efforts to expand renewable energy, address climate change, protect Connecticut's natural resources, and promote policies that strengthen both environmental and public health. As a key legislative leader, Senator Duff has played an important role in advancing bipartisan solutions aimed at building a cleaner, more resilient future for Connecticut communities. Senator Duff, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. How are you?
I'm doing well. Getting some rest.
Great.
Hopefully you are as well.
Not quite yet, but hope springs eternal at some point. But all good right now. I think we came off a good legislative session, and I think that gives us a little bit of energy going in. But first, I just want to thank Representative Steinberg for his years of service and his role in the Energy Committee. I was the Senate Chair of the Energy Committee prior, and in my last iteration before I become Majority Leader. And it's a hard job, and he's navigated it very well. So I appreciate all his activism and his work on it, along with yours, of course. And want to thank the League Conservation Voters for having me on today. A lot of good issues, and still a lot more work to do.
Excellent. I guess we'll start off. A number of senators are retiring at the end of this year, including President Pro Tem Martin Looney.
Yep.
As the likely next Senate President, what areas of energy and environment would you like your chamber to address?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's ever a shortage of things for us to address, especially on the environmental front. I mean, right now we've got the federal government, the Trump regime, that is literally just taking a hacksaw to any type of meaningful environmental legislation that's been around for decades, that has cleaned our environment, that has cleaned waterways and made our air cleaner, and generally made the environment a better place, where we've seen habitat restored, we've seen cars that are more efficient. We've seen introduction of electric vehicles, lots of different wins over the years. But between the Trump regime and the Supreme Court, we're heading, we have some headwinds, of course. But I would just say that for us anyway, it's important to know that Connecticut can stand on its own. I mean, I think it's helpful if we do act on a regional basis with our New England partners, and the best example of that is our cap and trade system that we have, that's been working for a very, very long time, and that's helped reduce pollution. The fact that we have wind energy is good, and that we're working with ICE in New England and bringing down Hydro-Quebec. That's important for us. So I think that continuing to focus on things, not everything has to be, not every year we have to have a big thing happen. We can have a series of small wins. And I would say, and that some of that is in the chemical policy reform area. Some of it may be on broader basis issues, but I think that as long as we kind of keep our focus on the environment and on kind of what we can control, and then maybe working in a regional basis too, that would be very helpful.
Great. Honing a little bit more on the energy front.
Yep.
The solar bill was a significant piece of legislation that passed the Senate in the final hours. We know that you had a significant role in passing that and want to thank you for that. While, it's a major step forward to ensure that continuation of incentives for solar in Connecticut, there's still a lot more work to be done in order to meet our very real clean energy goals. So,
Mhm.
is there anything, specific on the horizons that the Senate would consider to help, keep moving down the football field to reach those goals?
Well, I think, yes, I believe that, we will certainly look at everything that we need to do to help make sure that we're meeting our clean energy goals. Absolutely. Which is why, the solar bill was really important for us to get through. We always knew it was going to happen. Things, as folks who were on the inside may know or see things on the inside, that the it's kind of the wheels fell off the wagon a little bit with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle on Tuesday, and we had this overnight session, and they threatened to talk until midnight on the DOT bill or the gun bill. So we just said we'll stay, which we did, and that was that important to us to make sure we got done 5001, which is no excuse absentee balloting bill, plus the solar bill. Those were for Tuesday, Wednesday. Those were the most important things for us to do. And we wanted to make sure that we didn't capitulate ourselves to leave early in order to and then lose those pieces of legislation. So I think you saw a real commitment on behalf of the Senate Democrats and the entire caucus by hanging in there till 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock in the morning. I mean, I got home at I think 9:30 and had about 2 hour and a half sleep, and then turned around after I showered and changed my suit to go back up again. So I think that the commitment is there and the willingness is there to do what we have to do to push. But as you all know, you need two chambers and a governor to agree on things. And first, things have to start in committee. So that's why I think that it's really important that we all work together and work towards common goals, work and pushing legislators, pushing the legislature, understanding that we do have to continue to clean our environment. We have to be mindful of the costs in some ways because of the fact that many of us have constituents who can barely afford their electric bills or having a hard time putting food on the table because we know, again, this regime is increasing costs. Their inflation is higher, gas prices are higher. So we have to make sure that we are doing it in a balanced way that can gather the majority of votes in both chambers and in the governor's signature.
Great. Thank you. One more question. There are
Sure.
a lot of advocates on this call. The advocates were up in full force this session,
Yeah.
into the wee hours like you were. Um, with the new leadership coming in next year in the Senate, what can we as advocates do to, more effectively communicate with you and other leaders in the Senate in general to make sure that our priorities are heard and acted upon?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I appreciate it. And thanks again to all the advocates and everyone else who spent time with us on those long nights, and Lori Brown and others who were there, you and many others who were hanging out with us when other people were fast asleep. But I would say that the best thing you can do to help me or help the system in general is to have relationships with your individual legislators because it's one thing to convince somebody like me to do something, but you got to have the support of the caucus. And having those relationships, like starting now, have coffees, stay in touch, talk about the issues, educate legislators. Because again, we come in knowing what we know. And as Representative Steinberg said, he chaired the Energy Committee, not knowing much about energy and all those crazy acronyms that when came on the energy committee, same with me. I had no idea. I knew how to plug something in and turn on a light switch, but that was pretty much all I knew about energy policy. And then I became probably one of the uh, one of the foremost experts in energy policy in the legislature at that time. And then, you pass the baton to other people like Representative Steinberg and Senator Needleman, who then understand that as well. But it's really important for people to understand these issues because the environment may be a passion for you all, but their passion may be children's mental health, or it could be transportation policy, or it could be any number of things. So just know that those discussions, that education, those relationships are really, really important, and they help make my job easier when we're trying to pass legislation that's meaningful to you all and it's meaningful to our state.
Great. Well, Senator Duff, thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Yeah, my
Hopefully
pleasure.
you get a little bit of rest, and we look forward to staying in touch.
All right. Thanks so much. I appreciate it, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Representative John Michael Parker, co-chair of the Environment Committee. He has served as a dedicated leader on environmental and conservation issues in the Connecticut General Assembly, and this is his second session as co-chair of Environment. In his first year in that role, Representative Parker led a successful effort to pass major climate legislation. He has advanced legislation to connect Connecticut's natural resources, strengthened environmental safeguards, and promoted sustainability. Known for his collaborative leadership, commitment to public service, he has played an important role in shaping policies that support healthy communities and a cleaner future for Connecticut. So, Rep. Parker, thank you so much for being here. Was hoping you could just spend some time talking about the session, and then we can get to some Q&A.
Thank you, Connor. Thanks, Lori. Thanks for having us today, and good to be with everybody. I'm glad that Leader Duff joined, or else this would have felt like a retirement party. And I don't know if anyone was trying to send me a message, but very grateful for Rep. Steinberg's work and leadership. I have learned a lot personally from him, serving on the public health committee with him when I first joined, and learning a lot about how to get big stuff done. He's done that not just in energy and environmental issues in his public health leadership, which has been, I think, even more important across the state. And we are so grateful for it. You'll be greatly missed, Jonathan, and Senator. We're happy to have you upstairs and have you get us a couple Republican votes on our big bill. So you'll be missed as well. But yeah, Lori, you hit a lot of the high points, I think, in your overview. So I'll just kind of maybe give a brief rundown from my perspective, and then Connor, obviously welcome questions from you and from others. Lori, I'm glad that you started with the bottle bill, because that was where we started as well in a special session in inserting a bill earlier on, because as Lori mentioned, and I think a lot of you saw, the bottle bill is under intense scrutiny. We had to face down a bill through the Finance Committee, trying to move us back to 5 cents. We certainly heard calls from that on the floor, even an amendment that looked like it might be picking up some steam. And it has been critical for us to demonstrate, remind folks why we moved to this policy in the first place. Certainly celebrating Rep. Mishinsky was helpful to do that this year, and having her take out a bill or be speaker while we took out the bottle bill that we passed in regular session, got to again build that narrative of why this is an important environmental policy. But we had to convince folks of that, and then really do some heavy lifting to try to make the system work so that we can continue with a meaningful redemption system. The fight is not over on that. I think we held it off for another year. I think we put in place some mechanisms in our ESERT back in the beginning of the session, and then in the bill that we passed recently, that think about enforcement, and that try to sort of tweak the system so that the best actors can lift up and be at the forefront in managing the system going forward. But we didn't solve everything. We had conversations about a broader stewardship organization that we weren't able to push through. We had conversations about labeling that face some significant legal challenges that are still ahead of us. So I expect that we'll be continuing to work on this next year. I expect the calls to move our redemption rate back to 5 cents will be even louder in the future if we're not able to get some of these changes off the ground. And so I just appreciate you noting that, Lori, and everyone here thinking about that, and helping be a part of trying to make the system that we have work as best as it can, because I think it's a really important part of our efforts. Lori mentioned a few other nice bills that we're happy to have gotten done. The balloons bill, no intentional release. I think that was a long time coming, even if it feels like it's not the be all end all. But I think I think that was the bill that Rep. Dubitsky of all people said, "Come on, folks, this is a littering bill. Just pass the damn bill," and it passed unanimously in the House. Um, and I will say seriously on that point. I think our committee has succeeded because we've found a way to work well and in partnership with our Republican colleagues. Certainly, Red Callahan in the House has been a great partner to me, and I know Senator Lopes as another key ally, and even Senator Harding, who I think has a lot of environmental values at heart and is able to work with us to make a lot of these bills happen. Because as folks that follow the legislature closely know, when it comes down to it, it's all about negotiation and compromise and working together and avoiding um, the filibusters, the challenges that can throw off big bills there towards the end. And leaders like Leader Duff and Speaker Ritter and others only have so many hours to play with when it gets to the end of session. So truly, I think the work that we do to try to bring folks together and be reasonable, good, honest partners is critical for us to move forward. A couple of the bills that we worked on, the riparian bill, what a long effort that will continue, that we're grateful for. The fact that we got that funded position at Deep this year was really the big win that I'm now happy to say was top of our priority list. And even while some of the other policies got pushed around, that we carried that money into the budget was key. And so I'm so glad that played out the way it did, being able to get that money across. Obviously, we want to revisit the policy in the future, and we'll continue to do so. But I think the important win that we got now is something to be proud of. That's from Mashinsky has said so herself. The pesticides working group is going to be an important next step in terms of making sure that not just the agencies, but really industry is at the table when we're talking about updating that policy. A well-lobbied, well-represented industry has a lot of power in the legislative process. And so we need to do work way ahead of time to get them at the table and try to come up with solutions that are going to be workable and that we can get past. I think there's a similar story there with our continued efforts on waste. And for folks, again, that are looking at the long term here, we passed last year an important step with our waste characterization study and needs assessment that Deep is going to be working on so that we can come in next year with a more comprehensive waste policy update. That's something that Senator Lopes and I are both passionate about, have been doing a lot of work on. We've got a number of folks on our committee, Brett Baumgartner and others that are committed to that work. And I can't wait to come into 2027. Hopefully, if I can get myself back to Hartford next year to pick that back up. And I guess the last thing I'll mention on that list of things that we're happy to have passed is an important bill, maybe sometimes less inside of the CTLCV space, but in some more of our agricultural work, but a bill for farms and farmers, a lot of important funding into the dairy industry specifically, and then a number of tax policies and others aimed at supporting our local farmers, which that these folks are key allies in our broader efforts around conservation, environmentalism, stewarding the world and land around us in Connecticut and beyond. And so that's always an important part, I think, of our committee's work every year. I wanted to make sure I mentioned it here in this space. Lori mentioned the tires bill not getting through the Senate. I know Gresco is going to keep at that in the future, and I'm grateful for his leadership on it. Another cool environmental bill that got a lot of progress this year but didn't make it across was a bill about tribal hunting and fishing rights. Again, Rep. Baumgartner did excellent work with the tribes, with the CT Sportsmen. Again, really, I think bringing all the right folks together on the table to figure out a way to respect Indigenous rights with respect to tribal and hunting, fishing and hunting. And I think we've got now the policy that's workable, and we just got to figure out the time to make sure we can get it through both chambers next year. And then I'll sort of close my remarks just by noting again the work that needs to continue. So we've talked about waste a little bit. Lori mentioned the Superfund. Incredible to see Juliana, folks at Sierra Club, and others. A lot of young folks leading the effort around making polluters pay. We were proud to get that to the Environment Committee. I'm sure we'll be working on it again next year, and to keep that important conversation going. Senator Lopes led a bill on an insurance surcharge, also related to accountability and investing in mitigation and resilience, and then certainly keeping going with our waste work next year. So all in all, I think a busy but productive session. I think coming out of last session passing 5004 and SB9, two really big headline bills, priorities in each chamber that had a number of pieces that have been worked on for a long time. I think there was a risk that people would have been sort of all environmented out this year, but we were able to show up and I think get some meaningful work done and continue to push this agenda. And grateful for the folks here at the League and I know many allies that are on the call today for raising your voices and making sure these priorities got addressed in our chambers. So happy to take any questions that you've got, Connor.
Great, thank you. You mentioned the tribal hunting and fishing legislation. Speaking more to the environmental justice, can you talk about any other things you were working on this year, plan to work on next year, to help, help those communities?
I think the waste conversation is a big and important space where we think about EJ, and whether that's making sure we take smart steps related to permitting, but then also really thinking about the facilities where processing is happening, and making sure that smart, environmental, sustainable policy is fundable and affordable for folks in all communities across Connecticut. I think those are things that we're going to continue to focus on, and hopefully the work that we can do on waste in the coming years will really be reflective of that.
Great. I think we probably have time for one more question before we move on to Senator Hwang. This is now your second year as co-chair of environment after experiencing both a long session and a short session. Could you highlight some of the key differences in your approach to navigating environmental bills through? What have you learned that you can share with us, and that might help us, again, as advocates, similar to the question we asked Senator Duff, what's the best way to work with you moving forward?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I love Senator Duff's response, which is that the more relationships that folks have with all legislators, other legislators, maybe even especially outside of the folks that get to show up at these calls and have the privilege of being environmental champions and high scorecard and all the rest, is really when it comes down to helping leaders manage priorities in the context of very limited time and resources and attention. And so I think, encouraging folks to continue building those relationships with their legislators. Yeah, maybe they're members of our committee's environment or ENT or otherwise, or maybe not even. But when we have, it comes down to the session and we're trying to get folks to walk into leader offices and say these are priorities, that swell of voices is really critical. I think for my purposes, and I spoke on this a little bit earlier, but it was really, seeing that we're able to make progress when we're able to get voices together, potentially across opposition earlier on in the process and work through some of those differences. And then when it comes down to making compromises and ultimately being able to stand for, policies that are going to be a step forward, sometimes we can, I think, mitigate the opposition or the frustration or the obstinance when people can feel like they've at least been heard and be able to be a part of the process. And so I would rather take an incremental step than do nothing in any given area. And I think we saw that in a lot of places. I think the riparian bill was a real interesting test case for that. And it really was making sure that at the end of the day, we were balancing stakeholders from the governor's office, from multiple agencies, from industry, from enviros and advocates that, had versions of the bill that they weren't comfortable with. And ultimately, I really deferred to Mary's leadership, but I think we took the step that felt like it was appropriate for this year, and moved us forward. Is going to get another full-time person at Deep working on these issues and teeing up, I think, future regulation and policy. So for me, it's knowing that there are a limited set of issues that can sort of be muscled through at the Capitol, especially in a short session, but also in the context of all the other challenges that our communities are facing. And in order for us to make progress in the Environment Committee, again, I think in the context of what Jonathan said has felt like a shift in the last couple of years, really trying to do so in a way that is, if not always completely bipartisan, because not all of our big bills always pass that way, We certainly took a number of partisan votes in the committee and even the legislature on some of these issues in the chambers. Making sure that there's an inclusion and respectful dialogue, I think, is how we get work done. So grateful for folks that are willing to be a part of that process with us.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rep. Parker, for being here. Really appreciate your leadership in the Environment Committee. And yeah, hopefully you're getting some rest and spending time with the family. So excellent. Moving along, last but not least, Senator Tony Hwang. Senator Hwang has been a longtime champion of environmental stewardship and bipartisan collaboration in the Connecticut General Assembly. As Chief Deputy Republican Leader in the Senate, Senator Hwang has consistently demonstrated that protecting Connecticut's environment and advancing sustainable policies can and should transcend party lines. Throughout his legislative career, he has supported efforts to strengthen conservation initiatives, promote clean energy solutions, and build a healthier future for Connecticut. As he retires as well from public service, we want to recognize and thank Senator Hwang for his steadfast dedication, thoughtful leadership, and commitment to advancing environmental priorities through bipartisan cooperation. Senator Hwang, I don't know if you'd like to say a few things, and then we'll get to a couple of Q&A.
Absolutely. Thank you, Connor, Lori, and CTLCV for giving me an opportunity to participate. I think it's important to know that environmental stewardship has been deeply personal to me. It's rooted in a real simple belief that we're called to leave this world better than we found it as a policymaker, to really protect the beauty and the majesty of our open spaces, the health of our waterways, the strength within our communities and their public health, and really the future that we entrust to the future next generation. And we've heard this quite a bit, that in today's political climate, it can be very easy to see every issue between a partisan lens. And but to me, conservation, sustainability, and the reality of climate change doesn't belong to one party or one ideology. They belong to all of us. Clean air, clean water are not Republican or Democratic values as much as we kind of take a line on that. They're really human values to me. And protecting the places that we love and preserving the natural resources that sustain us needs to be a shared responsibility. And I believe it is a sacred trust that we have as a part of a community. So for me, that's been critical. And I'll say this, whatever leadership that I've been fortunate to offer in this space has really only been possible because I've kind of stood along with people that stood on their shoulders of extraordinary principle, knowledge, and persistence. And the person that comes to mind first and foremost is really Mary Mashinsky. She really deserves an opportunity for us to acknowledge her nearly 40 years of leadership. Her voice, her conviction, and her knowledge have really helped shape me. And she really is an environmental conscience for our state. I'm also grateful to work with Representative Steinberg as a bordering colleague in our districts for his thoughtful and passionate advocacy. But I also want to acknowledge the tireless advocates such as Mary Hogue, Joe McGee, Margaret Miner, who's taught me more about waterways, and Ken Bernhardt, and so many others. These are the people that their dedication and tirelessness really inspire and challenge me to be better. And I'll say another facet that I've learned as a political leader is this. Our young people are truly inspirational. From college to nearly elementary school, these young people inspire me to recognize that we have a responsibility to kind of find common ground. And, I think it's important to understand the policies that we've undertaken are critical and they're necessary, but we've heard repeatedly the word of affordability. And I think that's the balance that it's been difficult. You hear a lot about the national politics and how some of the changes, and you're right, Connecticut has been steadfast in holding the line and being the firewall against some of these drastic changes from the national policy, which I don't subscribe nor support, nor do I think they're scientifically based. But the reality is, spliced into that is a real concern about affordability, about people's ability to meet those kind of environmental challenges. I know Representative Steinberg talked about the public benefit. There's a lot of confusion related to it. And yes, I was the only Republican to have voted for the solar bill in the Senate. But to me, that was important from a long-term renewable energy sustainability aspect. But there were some cost considerations that were very valid that we needed to consider as it tacks on to our utility rates. So again, I'm honored to kind of be a advocate and to be steadfast and resilient in some of the principles that I stand for. But I've learned from so many of the advocates, Connor, you included, Lori, and all the other people that I mentioned, and many others that I didn't get to mention. But nonetheless, I think one of the hardest things moving forward is the fact that how are we going to balance environmental advocacy and sustainability and programs moving forward, but at the same time managing affordability for those that aren't thinking about what's going to happen 10, 20, 30 years from now, but being able to meet their mortgages and put food on the table. And that's the real challenge I think that we need as environmental advocates to make policies that are win-win to be able to articulate. So I'm sure one of the questions you'll ask, and I'll take questions, is how do we bridge the line between Democrat and Republicans in regards to environmental policy? I'll answer earlier by simply saying that we have to bridge the gap to understand that any environmental initiative has to have a cost. And the buy-in to reach that tipping point is going to be an economic impact. And we need to appreciate that and understand that and to be able to kind of adapt and incorporate that into the policy plan moving forward. Because that's the only way we can build sustainability and the kind of cultural as well as sustainability change that's necessary.
Great. Well, yeah, I mean, you hit one of the questions I had. But obviously that you hear lawmakers, some lawmakers being very vocal about, simply denying climate change. I mean, what sort of messaging has been effective, within your caucus when it comes to energy and clean energy, the environment, things like that, that we as advocates can help amplify?
Well, I think, Circa, which is part of the Yukon, but also a scientific based compilation of real resiliency on climate change and rising sea level is a huge resource. And I think if you really break down and talk about the science and the data points that are relevant related to climate change, it is undeniable. But I think for those that want that feel as though climate change is not applicable or as you might say, they're denying that climate change exists. The reality is this: it's an economic based rationale. They're understanding that climate change will happen and it's evolving, but nonetheless, they're more concerned about short term economic challenges. As I said, if you're worried about paying your mortgage, you're worried about your job, and in recent times, if you're worried about being able to pay for your utility bills, the reality of climate change is secondary for your economic motivations of being able to afford to live in the state of Connecticut. So again, climate change, without a doubt, when you look at the science, is undeniable. But nevertheless, people give rationale and kind of justify the denial by simply saying, look, I'm not paying into the public benefit. I'm not paying excessive rates of utilities and energy. And to adopt wind, solar, we're going to subsidize it to a certain point. Believe me, Connor, I've heard those arguments advocating for wind, solar, and renewable energy and carbon reduction. But I think we need to understand moving forward how we can bring everybody on board in a unified adoption of really sustainable policies. I think we need to really bring people on board and saying, how can we help in being able to understand your challenges, but these are long-term investments that need to be done right now, and how can we help manage that moving forward? I think that's the hardest thing I hear in my caucus is they don't want to talk about, what are the positives. They want to talk about the immediate impact on affordability. And make no mistake about it, this upcoming election cycle, affordability is going to be top of mind. And for all of my environmental advocates out there, they're great champions. I think you need to understand that when you talk to statewide candidates, gubernatorial, to your Senate and House member candidates, you really need to just make them understand that affordability is part of your understanding and consideration and appreciation as you move forward. And I think you'll get more adoptees. But I'll tell you another area that we don't hear a lot about that I think are absolutely critical champions are our municipal leaders. Our municipal leaders are real change agents beyond up at the state level. Our municipal leaders implement programs and impact young people and impact our community in solid waste recycling and waste management, but also sustainability and plantings and renewable energy. I think that's one part that many of us in Hartford or even in national policy don't really push for advocacy. And I've learned that from people like Mary Hogue, who has been Fairfield Sustainability. She's been a champion on that on the local level, even down to the elementary level, all the way up to the state level. So I think municipal impact, municipal advocacy is a huge momentum builder from the ground up.
That's great. I'm really glad you hit on that. I think we're pretty much out of time, but I just want to thank you so much, Senator. You've been an environmental champion for us, a great voice in the Republican Party for us, and you've served Fairfield and the surrounding towns very, very well. We look forward to keeping in touch, continuing to lean on you in your retirement. So thank you. Now I'm going to turn it over to Lori Brown one last time to close us out. So thank you.
Yes, I am always so impressed with our legislative leaders, our champions on the environment. They're so genuinely enthusiastic about the work and really do care about the environment. So we're definitely going to be missing those who are leaving, but also the ones who are staying, and then we'll be working with them, in the coming session and all of the advocates. So really appreciate your time, Senator Hwang, Senator Duff, Representative Parker, Representative Steinberg. You're just champions, and we appreciate you very much. This was recorded on CTN, so I know that others who might have missed this will be able to see this afterwards. If folks want to repeat, we'll also have it up on our site. And also just that we're going to be putting out our scorecard on all of the legislation and the session. That will be out probably towards the end of June, and it'll describe more in detail some of the issues that we talked about today and others, and also show how all of our legislators voted on these bills more. So thank you all so much for attending. Really appreciate all your hard work out there, and we'll see you in the next session.